It's a common theme in mythology, fairy tales, and assorted fantasy literature that the down on his or her luck orphan will find a benefactor to help him or her recover from misfortune and find happiness. Aladdin had the help of the genie in the lamp. Cinderella had her fairy godmother. Kal-El had Jonathan and Martha Kent. You probably know Kal-El better as Superman. Luke Skywalker had Obi-Wan Kenobi and later Yoda. Frodo Baggins had his uncle Bilbo and the wise Gandalf. And even Simba had Timon and Pumbaa when he ran away from home. Hopefully one of those is something you're at least familiar with. Those in need, especially the weak and powerless, need a helping hand to not only survive, but to make something of their lives. That helper in the stories that we love to read or watch when they've been turned into a movie often has magical abilities or profound wisdom and training to impart. But in real life, the need is simpler. What those to whom life has dealt a difficult hand need from those who have been blessed is simple: kindness. In our text today, we will return to Ruth, where she was hard at work, gleaning in the fields. She has no need to learn the ways of the forest or Hakuna Matata. Ruth just needs to be shown kindness, and who will step up and be her benefactor. So let us look at Ruth chapter 2, beginning in verses 8 and 9. It says this: So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So Boaz begins, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. Don't go away from here. Stay here." And we already know that Boaz is a close relative of Ruth's father-in-law, Elimelech, her late father-in-law, and that he is prosperous and well-regarded in his community. Here we learn something more about Boaz. We learn that he has combined a generous character with the good fortune he has had in life. Too often, those who have been given much in life treat that blessing as their own making and hold it tight as a miser in the tradition of Ebenezer Scrooge. Boaz, however, does not seem to be afflicted at all with the curse of greed. Boaz also calls Ruth "my daughter," a sign of familial affection that he certainly isn't obligated to extend to his second cousin's widow, or whatever the relation was between himself and Elimelech's son. That generosity of spirit that calls Ruth daughter is also a testament to Boaz, because he knows that Ruth is a Moabitess and no Israelite. That could have been an excuse to treat her poorly, and some people probably would have because of it. But not for Boaz. One factor that may have contributed to Boaz's kindness to a foreign woman is actually Boaz's mother. Boaz's father, Salmon, had married a foreign woman. You've heard of her. Her name is Rahab from Jericho. Perhaps Boaz knew firsthand what it was like to deal with animosity toward foreigners. Treating Ruth with kindness was a way for him to honor his mother. Well, Boaz was under no obligation, however, from the law of Moses, to do anything more than open up his field to any alien, orphan, or widow that would like to glean in it. To be welcoming and kind to Ruth is not the law, it's grace. Then he said, "Watch the field where the men are harvesting, follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you." The way it worked was the men would cut the stalks, and the women would follow after them to gather them into sheaves. Boaz has instructed Ruth to follow along after the girls to collect the ones that they miss. Second, but also important, Boaz lets Ruth know that his workers have been told to leave her alone. Not a small act of kindness for a young woman alone with no male relatives to protect her. He also told her that when she gets thirsty, she can have a drink from the water jars the men have filled. We don't know whether Boaz allowed everyone gleaning in his fields to help themselves to the water that the men had transported from the well for the workers or not. We don't know if he was that kind, but he did allow Ruth this kindness, and it will be a big help because she won't have to waste time walking to wherever the well is when she gets thirsty. It'll enable her to do that much more work while the sun is still up. None of these acts of kindness have cost Boaz very much, but they mean a lot to Ruth. For a rich man, giving someone $100,000, $1,000, even $10,000 may not really be all that much, a small sliver of their net worth. But for the poor man, that amount can be a huge, life-changing help. Notice also that Boaz continues to go beyond the letter of the law. He is, in fact, fulfilling the spirit of the law as well, by ensuring that Ruth not only has the right to glean in his field, but safety while she is there, and refreshment from the water as well. Verse 10, we'll see Ruth's response. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you notice me, a foreigner?" Maybe Boaz is just that nice to everybody, but Ruth suspects something is motivating him in her case in particular. She just doesn't know what it is. So bowing to show her respect, Ruth asks him the reason for his generosity. We know, among other possible explanations, that Boaz is related to Naomi by marriage, but Ruth does not yet know about that family connection. Verses 11 and 12. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz begins by saying, "I know all about the kindness that you showed to your mother-in-law when you left your homeland and came to a new place." For Boaz, Ruth's willingness to support her mother-in-law after the death of her husband is a character trait he believes to be worth celebrating. Ruth may have worried that her status as a Moabite would be a mark against her that hindered her in Israel. But Boaz makes no mention of her ethnicity, almost as if it does not matter to him, despite the narrator who continues to remind us again and again that Ruth is indeed a Moabitess. Instead, Boaz assigns great value to Ruth's loyalty and lets her know that his kindness is a form of repayment for her prior kindness to his relative Naomi. Boaz also mentions that Ruth has come to a land where she is a stranger, a potential handicap that he is able to help her overcome by extending the offer for her to continue to glean in his fields beyond this day. Boaz says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done." I find that interesting because Boaz has already taken steps to make this blessing a reality by helping Ruth himself. A helpful reminder to us that our prayers are much more effective when we combine them with a willingness to do our part to help them come to fruition. Then he says, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz considers the available kindness that he can show to Ruth to be insufficient recompense for the loyalty that she has shown to Naomi. And he also knows that the Lord, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, can bless her far and above what even he can do as a well-off and respected man. So what could God do for Ruth, and by extension Naomi? Let's brainstorm for a minute. Well, for starters, God could help them find a solution to their economic dilemma by putting together some sort of more permanent means of support. Right now, they only have the safety net of gleaning. That's a very base and minimal support in life. God could help them find something better. Secondly, God could solve Ruth's long-term need by finding her a husband that would be willing to help care for Naomi as well. And lastly, and most importantly, God could make himself known to Ruth, showing her his own hesed, which is the Hebrew word that we usually translate as loving kindness. God could show that to Ruth. Now that Ruth is living in the promised land of Israel, among the covenant people of God, it is time for her to know and be known by the Lord as a follower and worshiper of Yahweh, the great I Am, who gave the land of Israel to Abraham and the law to Moses. We assume that at some point in this journey, Ruth has made or will make that commitment to God. The text does not pinpoint for us when it happens, but the way in which Ruth will be used by God and of God at the end of this story to bring about his will for his people makes it all but certain that she did make that commitment. Boaz speaks metaphorically of the refuge offered by God, like a mother bird protecting her young, an image of particular significance to a foreign convert, one like Ruth, not raised in the faith, but brought to it by a particular act of the grace of God. This same offer of refuge from sin and death by God has been made available to all, not just to the children of Israel, by the gospel of Jesus Christ. We know this well, for we have come to take refuge under the protecting wings of the Lord. There is room, as we know, for all to come and find refuge here as well. Verse 13, Ruth responds again. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." We witnessed in our first message from Ruth the love and loyalty she displayed for Naomi. In our second message, we saw her admirable work ethic, a trait that she continues to display in our text today. And now she can add to those qualities the humble spirit that Ruth is demonstrating in her conversation with Boaz. Far from feeling entitled to Boaz's kindness, Ruth continues to show abundant gratitude, an indication that in her mind at least, Ruth was only doing that which is right when she stuck by Naomi. It was not logical for her to do so, but it was morally commendable. Yet Ruth has not let that choice puff up her pride. She has remained humble. The story of Ruth is a compelling one overall, as we will see once we've heard it to the full. In large part, however, because of the powerful testimony of the character of Ruth. We see it on display yet again here in her humility. Verses 14 through 16. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So at mealtime, Boaz says to her, "Come on over and enjoy the meal," and she eats her full. To work hard in the fields all day without food would be a difficult task for any of us to try to accomplish. Whatever food Ruth might have had for her supper already, and I'm guessing she probably had none, the further kindness shown to her by Boaz would have been a tremendous help. Once again, it has cost Boaz only a small amount, but benefited Ruth greatly. Boaz was under no obligation to give Ruth or any other gleaner in his fields a meal, but he chooses to invite her to sit at the table that he is sharing with his workers. That in itself is a significant sign of acceptance socially for this Moabite woman. That choice by Boaz will go a long way, since he is an important man, in silencing any prejudicial words that might have been headed towards Ruth, or any actions that the people of Bethlehem might have directed her way, because Boaz chooses to show that he socially accepts her. Now, Ruth is not working for Boaz, but notice that he's treating her better than most business owners treat their employees, treating her like family. This was the first day that Ruth had ventured out to glean in the fields in a strange land where she might have been rejected as an outsider. What did she expect when she left that morning? Had she any reason to hope for anything more than being allowed to glean without being harassed, if even her hopes were that high? It only took one man's kindness to silence whatever fears or doubts Ruth had harbored when the day began. When she gets up to glean, Boaz tells his men, even if she goes in the wrong place amongst the sheaves to embarrass her, actually pull out some extra and leave it for her. Even after all of the small kindnesses that Boaz has already shown to Ruth, he instructs the men who work for him to intentionally leave more of the stalks of grain behind to ensure that Ruth is able to collect enough to meet her need along with that of Naomi. Instead of giving her a handout, Boaz is hoping to utilize Ruth's strong work ethic so that she doesn't realize that the extra help she is getting is intentional. Anytime that charity can strengthen dignity and strengthen hard work instead of weakening them, it is certainly the better way to go about it. Some, like Naomi, might be unable physically or mentally to work like Ruth is able to. But for those who are able, we ought to imitate Boaz's hand up instead of a handout whenever possible. Notice also that Boaz has now brought his workers in on his strategy to help Ruth and Naomi. He first led by example, personally showing Ruth kindness, and now he is recruiting others to join him. 17 and 18. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much Ruth had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. After the meal break taken by Boaz's workers, Ruth returned to her labor of gleaning, continuing and presumably picking up those extra stalks that Boaz had instructed his men to accidentally leave behind. She continued until dark. When the harvest is ready, work continues as long as it is light. That is a truth that holds true to this day. When our farm equipment allows farmers to go even into the night and sometimes 24 hours a day when necessary. But in the ancient world, as long as you could see when the harvest was ready, you were out there in the field. So after spending all day, think about this, bending over to pick up individual stalks of grain, Ruth still had to thresh the barley. She had to separate the grain from the chaff in order to have something that could be turned into bread or stew or whatever it was that Ruth and Naomi were intending to make out of barley. When that second step was completed, then and only then Ruth went home to Naomi at the end of the long, hard days of work with 3/5 of a bushel of barley to show for it, which may or may not mean anything to you. I have no idea exactly how much a bushel is. It's a good size amount. Roughly 22 liters, if that helps, if you know your metric at all, which might help you picture it. But that is definitely better than if I simply said that she had 1 ephah, the ancient Hebrew measurement, which of course we have absolutely no idea how much that is. Well, none of us have ever gleaned in a field for a day. So we have absolutely no idea. Is that a good amount? Is that a lot for one day? Is that an average for one day? We've got no way to judge that. So let's not try to figure it out. Let's let Naomi tell us, and her reaction will guide us. Verses 19 and 20. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. Well, her mother-in-law definitely was surprised by the amount and says, "Blessed is the man who took notice of you." Upon seeing the fruit of Ruth's labor, Naomi right away concludes that she has been shown considerable kindness by someone. Otherwise, she couldn't possibly have gathered this much in one day. I think this moment marks the very beginning of the psychological and spiritual turnaround for Naomi, drawing her back from the funk of depression and bitterness that has enveloped her since the death of her sons. The long-term big picture may not have improved much. They still got those worries. But at least the short-term worries about likely privation and possible starvation, have been alleviated by whoever Ruth's benefactor is. So Ruth begins to tell her about this man in whose field she has been working. If he had just been a random neighbor, the man who owns the field that Ruth worked in this day would have shown considerable kindness to her and also to Naomi. If it was someone Naomi wasn't related to or didn't even know, it would have been a standalone act of kindness, a tremendous act of kindness. Great for the short term, but with limited long-term implications. You see, if you help someone in need while you are traveling, while you are out of town or out of state, and you should, if the opportunity presents itself, it will be a boon for that particular need, but not really much help for future needs. If, however, you help a neighbor, a friend, or a relative, the implications are much more significant because you have a relationship with that person. So Ruth tells her, the man in whose field I work today is named Boaz. We learned in verse 3 last week that as it turned out, which was the prompting of God's guidance, Ruth ended up in the field of Boaz. That simple choice that Ruth made, and I'm sure in her mind she thought, this is a random field. Let me just go into a random field. That choice will end up changing everything for these two widows. Why? Because Boaz is no random stranger showing kindness. He isn't even just a neighbor or friend. Boaz is family. And so Naomi says, the Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. I didn't read 20 yet. Let me read it. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman-redeemers. Naomi says, the Lord bless him. The kindness shown to Ruth and Naomi is also a gesture by Boaz that honors his deceased cousin, Elimelech, and second cousins, Mahlon and Chilion, once again assuming that that's what the relationship was between Boaz and Elimelech. Most of us have a good number of cousins. I couldn't even tell you how many cousins I have. I have a lot. A few of whom you may be close to. You know, you talk to them, you see them, you hang out with them. But most, we probably don't see very often. How much help would you expect in a time of need from a relative of yours? Not your sibling, not your parent, not your child, your second cousin. Would you be expecting that second cousin to show up after you lose your job and help you? Probably not, right? And yet Boaz has stepped up to help the widow of his relative. A powerful gesture of dedication to one's family that people in the modern world sadly imitate all too infrequently. We don't live with our extended family. We don't know them. We don't help each other like they did. Naomi says that man is actually a close relative. He is one of our kinsman-redeemers. If Boaz had been Elimelech's brother, the text would have identified him as such because of how close that would have been. We will learn next week that he is not the closest living relative of Elimelech, but he is still close, whatever that means to Naomi. A designation that sets in motion the upcoming change of events that will all center around the concept that Naomi has just told us about, the concept of the kinsman-redeemer. The kinsman-redeemer is a legal and ethical obligation in ancient Jewish culture and in the law of Moses. We will learn more about it in each of our final two messages from Ruth, and also something it is also a concept that we will apply on the end of that last message to Christ, who we are told is our kinsman-redeemer. So keep it in mind as we go through the story, this notion of the kinsman and redeemer. For now, let us simply lay out the basics of the concept, and we'll see how it applies to Ruth and Boaz as the story continues. So here it is, beginning with the closest relatives. So in other words, a brother would come before an uncle, a nephew before a cousin, etc., beginning with the closest male relatives. The kinsman-redeemer had two interrelated obligations or opportunities. They are connected. They were his to fulfill on behalf of a deceased male relative. First off, his first obligation/opportunity is to buy back family property that has been rented out or sold. So if the family farm has been sold or rented, he needs to buy it back. Secondly, this one's a little different. He needs to marry the childless widow to raise up a child in her dead husband's name, who will one day inherit that piece of redeemed property. So he buys back the land and marries the widow in order to give the land to the son of the widow, not to himself. It's an interesting arrangement that they have. We'll talk more about it next week. Well, Boaz is one of these potential kinsman-redeemers. We don't know how many there were. There are at least two, because there's one that's closer than he is. Next week we will learn and think about why none of them have stepped up to fulfill that obligation yet to Ruth and Naomi. This is the first we've heard of it. We will also find out whether or not Boaz is willing to do his part. For now, the kindness of Boaz as a kinsman-redeemer is going to give Naomi something she has not had in a long, long time. Hope. 21 through 23, we'll finish up our text for today. Then Ruth, the Moabitess, said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.' Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed.' So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law." Ruth is told, Ruth, once again, the Moabitess said, he even said, "Stay until all of my grains are harvested, not just the barley." We now learn of even more kindness from Boaz in his invitation to Ruth to stay beyond the end of the barley harvest and continue gleaning in his fields. Notice that the author once again reminds us that Ruth is the Moabitess. Her foreign status has not hurt her thus far. It has not kept Boaz from showing her kindness. But it may be a factor. It may be a factor when we consider the primary kinsman-redeemer responsibilities. We cannot forget that Ruth is the Moabitess. The story won't let us. Second part of this, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Good for you to stay there, because somewhere else you might be harmed." Yikes! Think about that. Working in broad daylight, outside in the fields. Naomi was worried that Ruth might have been physically and, frankly, probably even sexually assaulted while working in the fields. The period of the Judges, we know, was a dark and difficult time in the history of Israel. But to think that a widow would need to fear for her safety, perhaps in part because she is obviously a foreigner, is a sad commentary on the level of the people's commitment to God, on their social justice. Well, unfortunately, our culture can relate to this all too well. Women and foreigners are often targeted for violence in our society, both of which types of violence ought to be abhorrent in all their forms to the people of God. So Ruth did stay with Boaz's servant girls, gleaned until the harvest was finished. We conclude this section with Ruth continuing to work hard in the fields, and with Boaz continuing to show her, and by extension Naomi, kindness. What is the primary lesson then for us from today's text? It's a very simple lesson. The power of small, sustained acts of kindness cannot be underestimated. That is simply it. Small, sustained acts of kindness can be very powerful. We may not have the power or the resources to change the world, and so maybe we think we can't do anything, although we ought to know that our God can. But we can change one life by starting to and continuing to show that one person the love of Jesus Christ. That is something we can, we should, and we must do.